The wind howled through the rail yard like a living thing, tearing at the frozen edges of Cheyenne as if it had a score to settle. Snow whipped into the air, stinging exposed skin, and buried the world in a blinding, white rage. Blue, the search dog, skidded on the ice, her paws leaving fleeting prints that vanished before they could even be noticed. Then she froze, ears pricked, nose low to the frozen earth, letting out a howl that carried across the empty tracks and rattled the still night. Every person who heard it felt a chill crawl up their spine. The freight car loomed above, rusted and menacing against the dark, gray sky. Underneath it, the snow shifted strangely, as though it resisted the wind's relentless assault. And then, the shape appeared. A body, partially buried. A silent testimony to a life stolen in cold defiance. The air seemed to thicken, as if the world itself was holding its breath, mourning with raw intensity. Most people never imagine their last walk home becomes a legend whispered across 50 winters, but this was Sandra Miller, 25 years old. A daughter, a sister, a woman whose absence would echo for decades. Have you ever walked home in a storm, feeling the wind cut through every layer, every defense, every ounce of safety you thought you had? That night, she vanished without a sound, and the city slept ignorant of the horror that had passed through its streets. Detective Marshall Briggs knelt beside her, the weight of grief pressing down with every heartbeat. A single strand of hair clung to her coat. A button, dark and foreign, refused to be forgotten. He whispered into the icy wind, promising a justice that would stretch across decades. The wind carried the words away, and still, the promise lingered, heavier than the snow itself. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, if you enjoy powerful cold case stories like this, you may want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And let us know the country you're watching from in the comments. We truly love reading them. Sandra Miller was more than a name whispered in tragedy. She was the pulse of her family, a light that had carried warmth through every corner of their lives. At 25, she held a quiet strength that drew people in. Her mother, Dolores, relied on her guidance and laughter, while her younger brother, Franklin, looked up to her with the unspoken devotion only a sibling could hold. Every day, Sandra's presence stitched ordinary moments into a pattern of love and reassurance, the kind of stability that goes unnoticed until it vanishes. At the Western Union Telegraph office, Sandra's voice carried a balance of efficiency and kindness. She was the bridge between hearts across the country, delivering messages of joy, grief, and longing. Her colleagues knew her as the one who noticed the smallest details. A smile for the lonely sender, a gentle word for the frantic caller. Leland Tex Whitaker, her co-worker and friend, remembered her laughter spilling over the keys as she worked the evening shift, a sound that now felt impossibly distant. On the 14th of December 1969, the snowstorm came not only with the threat of frostbite and numb hands, but also with the invisible threat of someone watching, waiting, and striking. The simple routine of driving 5 miles home, heating a tin of soup, and calling her mother was all Sandra had planned. A life that should have continued with unremarkable beauty was ripped from her in an instant. Her absence was a hollow scream, echoing through the streets, the house she left behind, and every heart that loved her. Every moment of her life that was stolen now demanded justice, and for the city of Cheyenne, for her family, and for the generations that would come after, this was just the beginning of a story that would refuse to stay buried. The wind that night was unforgiving, a frozen predator sweeping across the plains, stripping warmth from anyone who dared to face it. Cheyenne's streets were deserted, the snowdrifts so high they swallowed familiar landmarks, and the Mustang sat abandoned like a relic of the terror that had passed through. Sandra's keys were gone, her leather handbag left behind, a cruel reminder that someone had taken more than just her body. They had stolen safety, trust, and the future she deserved. Every gust of wind seemed to mock the helplessness of those searching for her. Volunteers trudged through blinding snow, their boots sinking into icy drifts, hoping for a sign, a clue, anything to bring her back. But the storm refused to cooperate, erasing footprints, masking the faintest hint of a struggle. Nature itself became an accomplice, shielding a crime that would chill the city for decades. The danger was invisible yet immediate. One misstep, one wrong turn in the frozen darkness, and anyone could become another victim, lost to the snow and wind. The city had never felt smaller, colder, more suffocating. The very environment that nurtured life during the day had become a trap at night, hiding cruelty where no one would suspect. Have you ever felt unsafe walking alone during a storm, knowing the world around you could turn against you in an instant? That fear, that tension, was Sandra's last companion, and in that fear lay the cruel brilliance of the killer's choice. A storm to vanish into, a city to bury the truth under layers of white silence, leaving grief to fester in every home, every heart. Detective Marshall Briggs stood over the snow-draped body, his breath forming clouds that mingled with the blizzard's rage. Each strand of hair and the single, dark button in his gloved hand was a fragment of a story that refused to be told. A cruel tease of the justice that had slipped through decades of Cheyenne winters. Anger and grief collided in his chest, a weight that pressed down harder than the snow itself. He wanted to scream at the sky, to punish the wind for erasing footprints, for hiding the truth in the white expanse, for letting a killer escape while innocence froze. Sandra Miller had been stolen from life in a way that left no one untouched. Her mother, Dolores, frantic and desperate, would soon stand where Briggs did, confronting a silence that shouted louder than any words. Franklin, still a boy, would grow up shadowed by absence, haunted by a question with no answer. And the city Cheyenne, rugged and proud, would carry the guilt of ignoring a threat that had walked freely among them for years. The winter had swallowed more than her body. It had swallowed peace, safety, and the sense of order that a community clings to when tragedy strikes. Each frozen flake seemed like a mocking whisper. This crime is larger than your reach. This pain will linger. The face of the killer will remain unseen. Yet Briggs refused to relent. He locked away every detail, every fragment of evidence, believing that one day someone would see the pieces in a way that would demand justice. Stay with us. Cases like this vanish without witnesses. Don't miss the truth. The shadow of the unknown stretched across Cheyenne like the long night of a prairie winter, cold and unyielding. And as the city slept unaware, the ghost of Sandra Miller began her long wait, not in peace, but in the quiet, aching hope that someone, one day, would finally answer the questions her death had left behind. Sandra Miller was the kind of person whose presence could fill a room without making a sound. At 25, she carried warmth in every glance and steadiness in every gesture. Her family leaned on her in ways they might not even realize. Her mother, Dolores, trusted her judgment and her comforting words, while her younger brother, Franklin, admired her strength and independence. She was a light in their lives, constant and unwavering. At the Western Union office, Sandra's role went beyond supervision. She handled wires of joy, grief, and news that could change a person's day in an instant. Every message that passed through her hands carried a little of her care, a little of her attention. Her colleagues noticed it in the smallest ways: a gentle question, a reassuring nod, a quick laugh shared across the office. Tex Whitaker, who worked alongside her, remembered her laughter echoing over the telegraph keys, a sound that could ease the weight of any long shift. Even in the routine of her daily life, Sandra's presence created a sense of security and connection. You could sense it in the way she greeted friends, in the way she managed her responsibilities without fanfare, and in the way she paused to notice someone's struggle or joy. Every action, ordinary on the surface, carried the imprint of someone who cared deeply and lived fully. That night, Sandra walked out of the office with the same composure she always held. She didn't know that this simple, familiar routine, gathering her coat, pulling on her gloves, stepping into the snow, would become the last chapter of her life for decades. The normalcy of her world had shifted in an instant, leaving only the memory of who she was and the space she had filled so completely. Quick confession before we go on. My wife said I won't hit 1,000 subscribers before Monday. She even laughed at me. Laughed. Please, Don't let her have this victory. Hit that subscribe button so I can walk into the living room like a champion." Sandra gathered her coat and gloves, the wool biting against her skin, and stepped into the night. The great freeze had settled over Cheyenne, turning every breath into a shard of ice. The streets were nearly empty, the wind carrying drifts of snow that swirled in chaotic patterns, hiding familiar landmarks and making each step uncertain. The Mustang sat waiting in the office lot, cream-colored and ordinary, but on this night, it became the portal to a world she would never return to. You can feel the quiet tension in the air as she slid into the driver's seat, hands trembling slightly against the cold steering wheel. She adjusted her scarf, started the engine, and watched the snow dance across the windshield. Every instinct she relied on the rhythm of her routine, the knowledge of these streets, the trust in the world around her was about to be tested in a way she could never anticipate. The night that had seemed like any other had shifted into something cruel and unpredictable. Tex Whitaker had waved her off from the office window, unaware that this farewell carried the weight of finality. Sandra's mind lingered briefly on the warmth of the office, the comforting familiarity of her work, and the soft glow of the telegraph lights fading behind her. Even in that ordinary act, there was a trace of hope, a belief that she would return home safely, that her mother would hear her voice at the end of the line. The wind clawed at the Mustang as she pulled away, snowflakes stinging her face through the crack in the window. There was a sense that someone or something was waiting just out of view, a presence unseen but ever looming. The streets that had always felt safe now held a quiet, suffocating threat. Dolores Miller waited by the phone, the ticking of the wall clock marking each passing minute like a hammer against her chest. She knew Sandra's habits: always punctual, always careful, always checking in. Yet the phone remained silent. A growing unease settled over her, prickling the edges of fear she tried to ignore. With each moment that passed, the cold outside seemed to seep through the walls, chilling her bones and her thoughts alike. By 11 o'clock, worry became a pressing urgency. Dolores bundled herself in her heaviest coat, gloves tight, and stepped into the blizzard. The snow had transformed the streets into shifting, white rivers, and every step was met with resistance from the wind that seemed determined to push her back. She drove through the storm with only a faint hope of finding her daughter safe. Each intersection, a gauntlet of snow and ice. Each shadow, a whisper of what might have gone wrong. Her eyes searched the familiar route from the office to their home, tracing every corner, every alley, every quiet street where danger could hide. The mind races in these moments, filling silence with the worst possibilities, imagining scenes too cruel to bear. Every blizzard-lashed building, every deserted street, every muffled sound heightened the tension, pulling her heart tighter with each mile. And then she saw it, the Mustang, parked in the office lot, engine cold, as if it had never moved. Her heart dropped, a weight that made her chest ache with helplessness. The door was ajar, and snow had drifted into the interior, dusting the seats and dashboard with a quiet, accusing hand. Dolores stepped closer, gripping the edges of the car, the sense of dread expanding with every breath. Something had gone terribly wrong, and the realization slammed into her with brutal clarity. Dolores approached the Mustang with trembling hands, her breath fogging in the frigid air. The snow-covered lot seemed endless, silent except for the wind that cut through her coat and whispered warnings she couldn't ignore. The engine was cold, the familiar hum of the vehicle replaced by a deafening stillness. Her eyes swept the interior and landed on the leather handbag lying untouched on the passenger seat. The keys were gone. Every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. The door creaked under her hand as she leaned closer, noticing the drift of snow inside, fine and unyielding, as if the storm itself had claimed a stake in this moment. A sense of disbelief, mixed with terror. She had driven through this same storm countless times, confident in her steps, yet now the city felt hostile, a frozen labyrinth where every corner could hide danger. Her heart hammered, fear tightening its grip as she imagined the possibilities, each one more unbearable than the last. Every detail, the missing keys, the untouched bag, The snow brushing the seat was a signal screaming that Sandra hadn't returned home. Dolores called out, her voice breaking, muffled by the blizzard, demanding an answer from a silence that offered none. The emptiness of the lot, the absence of any sign of her daughter, amplified the horror. Time stretched, each second a sharp reminder of her powerlessness, each heartbeat a drum of anxiety. Would you have waited, or gone looking like Dolores did? Tell me in the comments. In that moment, the ordinary world Sandra had left behind vanished. The Mustang, abandoned and cold, became the first piece of a puzzle that would haunt Cheyenne for decades. It was the start of a story that no one could ignore. A story where the warmth of a daughter's presence had been replaced by the unrelenting grip of fear and the haunting knowledge that someone, somewhere, had stolen more than a life. They had stolen the certainty of safety for everyone who loved her. The moment the Mustang was discovered, the Cheyenne Police Department sprang into action. The wind cut through every layer of clothing, slicing across the snow-covered streets, as officers scrambled into the blizzard with a sense of urgency that weighed heavier than the ice settling on their boots. Temperatures had plummeted to deadly lows, and every second counted. You can feel the city holding its breath, knowing that in this cold, time was not on anyone's side. Calls went out to every available officer, and messages rippled through the small town like the crack of a whip across frozen plains. The citizens, already wary of the harsh winter, felt a growing unease. Mothers pulled their children inside, closing doors against the wind, and neighbors peered through frosted windows, wondering if they were witnessing a tragedy unfolding that none could stop. The streets were empty, save for the occasional patrol, and the silence of Cheyenne that night was only punctuated by the howl of the wind and the crunch of boots in fresh snow. Officers knew they were racing against more than just time. They were racing against the lethal grip of the cold. Every minute delayed could mean losing crucial evidence, and every step outside was a gamble against frostbite and exhaustion. You sensed the weight pressing down on them, the stakes magnified by the unrelenting elements. As the city braced itself, each officer carried the responsibility of finding answers quickly, knowing that a life, or at least the memory of a life, depended on their resolve. Even in those first hours, the tension was unbearable. The Mustang had revealed a quiet but terrifying truth. Someone had vanished into the night, leaving only questions and a trail buried in snow. The urgency was immediate, raw, and impossible to ignore. The blizzard was a silent accomplice, and the search had just begun. Volunteers poured into the streets, bundling themselves against the biting wind, their faces red and raw from the cold. Ranchers, neighbors, and members of the Frontier Days Committee joined the police, forming lines that cut across snowdrifts and frozen fields. Each step was a struggle, boots sinking into powdery snow, ice threatening to betray their footing. The blizzard had turned the city into a maze of white, every familiar landmark obscured, every path treacherous. You can feel the exhaustion settling in as they pressed forward, hands numb, bodies shaking, but determination burning hotter than the cold. The search was relentless, moving through alleys, behind buildings, along the edges of rail yards where shadows clung to the frozen ground. Every drift, every mound of snow, became a potential hiding place for the missing. A reminder of the fragile line between hope and despair. The volunteers shouted over the wind, voices carrying in bursts that were almost swallowed by the storm, calling out Sandra's name as if sound alone could draw her back. Despite the collective effort, frustration built with every passing hour. The snow erased footprints almost as soon as they were made, and visibility was so poor that even a few feet ahead could seem unreachable. The cold was merciless, numbing hands and faces, but no one stopped. Every moment felt like a race against an enemy you couldn't see, against a force that was indifferent to life, and against time that threatened to bury the truth beneath layers of frost. And yet, through the white chaos, a single sense of purpose drove them on. They weren't just searching for a missing person, they were fighting against the weight of the night, the blizzard, and the unknown. Every heartbeat carried the hope of discovery, the need to reclaim what had been lost, and the fear of what might be waiting under the snow. The search dog, Blue, led the way, nose to the frozen ground, ears alert against the howl of the wind. Volunteers followed, tense and silent, as if the storm itself demanded quiet. Then Blue stopped, stiffened, and began to howl a long, mournful sound that cut through the blizzard like a warning. Every heart in the group tightened, a cold realization creeping in. The missing girl was close. You move forward with them, snow crunching under every step, the wind stinging cheeks and numbing fingers. The shadows beneath the decommissioned freight car are deeper than the night itself, and the frost-laden ground glints as if hiding secrets. As Blue circles and continues to bark, volunteers strain their eyes, breath ragged, lungs burning from cold and exertion. Time seems to stretch unnaturally, each second heavy with dread. And then the outline becomes clear, something half buried beneath the snow. The body is partially obscured, frost clinging to hair and clothing, each detail magnified in the silence of the blizzard. The realization hits like ice to the chest. She isn't lost to the storm, but to something far more cruel. Shock ripples through the searchers, the brutality of the moment sinking in. Every instinct tells them to step back, but they can't turn away from what they've found. No footprints lead here, no witnesses, no immediate clues, only the wind, the snow, and the stillness of a life violently interrupted. You can feel Detective Briggs's breath hitch as he surveys the scene, understanding instantly that the storm has erased every trace of the one who did this. His vow comes instinctively, carried by the wind. We'll find him, Sandra. The words are more than promise. They are the start of a battle against time, nature, and a darkness that is hidden in plain sight for too long. Detective Marshall Briggs stood over the scene, the wind biting through his coat, frost settling on his eyebrows. Years on the force had taught him many things, but nothing could prepare him for a sight like this. No footprints, no signs of struggle, only the snow-covered evidence of a life taken. The storm had done what a criminal might envy, erased every trace, leaving the city with nothing but questions and dread. You can sense his frustration, the tight knot of anger and helplessness in his chest. He knew the killer had vanished into the night with absolute invisibility, leaving the town to grapple with the horror and uncertainty. Every glance at the freight car, every detail of the frozen ground, reminded him of how fragile human safety can be when the world itself becomes an accomplice. The blizzard was more than a storm. It was a mask that concealed violence, and it had chosen Sandra Miller as its witness. Briggs' eyes scanned the empty streets, the lifeless tracks, the frozen echoes of what had transpired. He made notes, collected the few fragments of evidence the wind had allowed to remain, and committed each observation to memory. Yet the absence of leads gnawed at him. In that silence, a vow formed, not just a promise, but a declaration. Sandra would not be forgotten, and whoever had done this would not escape. The weight of 50 winters of unanswered questions would not deter him from seeking justice. If danger walked past your front door tonight, would you even know? Subscribe to stay aware. The detective's breath formed clouds in the icy air, his resolve unwavering. The snow had hidden the truth, but it had not destroyed it. Every layer of frost, every drifting flake, every silent alley would be combed, analyzed, and remembered. For Sandra, for her family, for a town held hostage by fear, Briggs carried the responsibility of keeping hope alive. This was only the beginning of a story that would stretch across decades, where patience, persistence, and the faintest traces of evidence would be the only weapons against a hidden evil. The city of Cheyenne didn't just mourn Sandra Miller. It transformed under the weight of fear and suspicion. Streets that once echoed with children's laughter became quiet after sunset. Shops closed earlier, and neighbors peered warily from windows, measuring shadows, as if danger could slip past without warning. Every winter evening, the wind carried a sense of unease, and even familiar faces seemed to hide uncertainty behind carefully drawn curtains. Parents clutched their children tighter, holding them close against the dark that now felt alive with threat. Social events dwindled, Laughter turned guarded, and ordinary life was now measured against a backdrop of what could go wrong. The community spoke less and whispered more, and the murder of a single woman became a cautionary standard for safety in a city that prided itself on openness. Every cold gust of wind, every drifting snowflake, reminded everyone that danger had already walked among them once, and it might again. You sensed the weight pressing on the city's shoulders, a collective unease that never fully lifted. Shops, schools, and homes continued, but the rhythm of life had changed. People locked doors they once left open and questioned anyone who lingered too long at a street corner. Cheyenne had grown cautious, tense, and watchful. A town carrying the invisible scars of a single night that had rippled across an entire decade. Even as the years passed, Sandra Miller's absence was a persistent echo. Families who had once trusted neighbors now hesitated at small kindnesses. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, eyes darted to shadows, and trust became a fragile currency. The city itself seemed to remember, holding the memory of her life and the sudden absence with quiet reverence, as though each snowfall was a memorial and each icy wind a reminder of the night Cheyenne lost its sense of innocence. Dolores Miller lived each day as if the 14th of December, 1969, had never ended. Sandra's bedroom remained untouched, a shrine to the life that had been stolen. The bed was made with corners so crisp they cut through the cold air, and Sandra's Western Union cap rested precisely where she had left it. On the nightstand, a half-finished mystery novel waited patiently, pages yellowed but unmoved, as though time itself had frozen in respect. You can feel the heaviness in every object, the quiet weight of a mother's grief made tangible. Dolores moved through the house with reverence, avoiding even the smallest disturbance, as if touching the room too much might erase the presence of her daughter entirely. Every glance at the walls, every brush against the furniture, carried an echo of memory. Meals were quiet, conversations subdued, and the normal rhythms of life bent around the absence that could not be filled. Neighbors noticed the change. The Miller home became a landmark of sorrow, a silent testament to the void left behind. Visitors hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether to speak or move, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath. The room was more than a collection of belongings. It was a vessel for memory, a constant reminder of a life interrupted, and a daily confrontation with the cruelty of fate. Dolores's devotion became a ritual that consumed her days. Each morning, she opened the blinds to let the cold light in, as if acknowledging the world beyond her daughter's absence. Each night, she whispered Sandra's name into the shadows, a quiet plea for comfort or understanding that never came. You can sense the weight she carried, a sorrow that was both personal and universal, the kind of grief that bends the living toward obsession. Even as time passed, the room remained untouched, a physical representation of loss, a space where the past refused to move on, and where hope waited for a resolution that would not arrive for decades. Franklin Miller grew up under a shadow that never lifted. At 15, he had already felt the sharp edge of loss, the weight of a sister taken too soon, and the helplessness of watching a mother sink into a grief that had no end. Every milestone in his life, graduations, birthdays, first jobs, was marked by the absence of Sandra's laughter. Her presence, her guidance. The empty chair at the family table became a symbol of what was missing, a constant reminder that life could change in a single night. You can feel how trauma shaped him, the quiet obsession that took root in his mind. Franklin became a meticulous observer, scanning newspapers, combing through old reports, and memorizing every detail of the case. The blizzard, the abandoned Mustang, the freight car all haunted him with a relentless persistence. Friends came and went, unaware of the silent burden he carried, unaware that his world had been frozen in 1969 while the rest of Cheyenne moved forward. Even ordinary experiences were colored by the past. School dances, family holidays, and summers in the Wyoming sun carried the faint shadow of what had been lost. Franklin's questions were endless, his curiosity insatiable, driven not by mere interest but by a need for justice, a need to reclaim the life that had been stolen from his family. He spent hours in libraries, poring over microfiche, following the faintest leads, hoping that somewhere a forgotten detail would point to the truth. The years molded him into a man defined by absence, yet strengthened by it. His dedication to finding answers became a silent pact with his sister, a vow that her story would not be erased. You can sense the intensity of a life lived in waiting, haunted by questions that no one else could answer, driven by the hope that one day the truth would surface and the long shadow of that night would finally lift. Over the years, Sandra Miller became more than a memory. She became a cautionary tale whispered across Cheyenne. Parents spoke her name in hushed tones to daughters who lingered too long outside, and young men heard the story as a warning about the darkness that could hide behind familiar faces. The Telegraph Girl was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of vulnerability, a ghost that inhabited conversations and filled empty rooms with questions that never found answers. Detective Marshall Briggs carried the case like a weight that refused to lift. Retirement loomed, yet the evidence box sat on his desk, a constant reminder that justice had been delayed and perhaps denied. You can feel the frustration tightening around him, the years of dead ends, the files that grew thicker while hope grew thinner. Each time he opened the box, he whispered apologies to Sandra, as if speaking could bridge the gap between life and loss. He studied the button, the hair strands, the few traces that had survived 50 winters, knowing that one day, these fragments would speak louder than any confession. The community, too, changed under the shadow of uncertainty. The murder became woven into local folklore, stories passed down with each generation, adding layers of fear and respect. Shops remained closed longer, children were brought inside before dusk, and the city itself seemed to pause whenever a blizzard approached. Even decades later, strangers in Cheyenne were cautioned by residents to be wary of the night, to understand that the past had teeth, and that lessons learned from a single tragedy could echo across generations. And yet, amidst the silence, a quiet curiosity persisted. Briggs' eyes lingered on the evidence box, on a single item that had never yielded its secret. You can sense the anticipation, the unspoken promise that it would one day unmask the man who had hidden in plain sight. Have you ever lived with a question that haunted you for years? For 50 winters, the city waited, the grief endured, and the silence carried the weight of unanswered questions. The stage was set for a reckoning, and the smallest clue in that evidence box was poised to rewrite history. Detective Bennett Cross stepped into the cold case office with a mix of determination and apprehension. The weight of 50 years of unanswered questions pressed down on him, heavier than the Wyoming winter. He carefully lifted the cardboard evidence box left behind by Briggs, feeling the rough edges of time and the quiet tension of decades of silence. Inside were fragments of a life stolen too soon, strands of hair, the dark, solitary button, the faint traces of struggle that had survived the snow. You can sense the responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just another file. This was Sandra Miller, a young woman whose absence had shaped generations. Cross had heard the whispers in the department, the stories of a town frozen by tragedy, of a family living in suspended grief. He was determined not to let history repeat itself, not to allow the case to remain a shadow in someone else's memory. Cross spent hours examining the details, reading old reports, memorizing every account of the night Sandra disappeared. Every scrap of information mattered. Every observation could be a breakthrough. He understood the pressure not only from the community, but from the silent expectation of a family that had waited far too long. Every glance at the box reminded him that time was a cruel accomplice, that decades could erode not just evidence but hope itself. As he prepared to initiate new investigative steps, a quiet resolve formed. Cross knew the first steps were always tentative, but the promise of emerging technology gave him a spark. Somewhere within this box, within the traces left behind by a killer hiding in plain sight, lay the possibility of finally ending the wait. He was determined to unlock it, to give the Miller family a fragment of the justice that had been delayed for so long. The 1,980 seconds brought whispers of a revolution in forensic science DNA. Across the country, investigators were beginning to unlock the secrets hidden in hair, skin, and blood, tracing the smallest fragments of life to their source. In Cheyenne, the news sparked a quiet frenzy. For the first time in decades, people dared to hope that the silence surrounding Sandra Miller's murder might finally break. You could feel the city holding its breath. Families who had watched the case grow colder now spoke in cautious optimism, speculating that technology could do what human eyes and old notebooks could not. News of labs experimenting with DNA spread through the police department and into the hands of those who had waited, prayed, and feared for 50 years. Even the youngest officers began to understand that this new science could bring light to a darkness that had never been pierced. Franklin Miller's excitement mirrored the city's. He clutched at the possibility that the decades-long void could finally be filled, that the man who had robbed his family of happiness might be revealed. Every meeting with Cross, every update on the progress of the samples, was a surge of anticipation. Even the community felt the shift, a subtle sense that the long-held tension might finally loosen its grip. Detective Cross coordinated with the labs, sending off the fragile strands of hair and the lone button. His hands steady but his mind alive with the weight of expectation. Every step forward felt monumental, each moment a small bridge connecting past despair to potential justice. You can sense the collective hope, fragile but intense, that this technological miracle might finally allow Cheyenne to exhale, even if only slightly. After so many years of holding its grief close, the city waited, tense but alive with anticipation, ready to see if science could succeed where human investigation had faltered for half a century. Franklin Miller's heart raced with every update. Each phone call, each whispered report from the police, felt like a thread pulling him closer to the truth. For the first time since that December night, he dared to believe that the decades of silence might finally end. The years of watching shadows, of reading old articles, of reliving every moment of that blizzard, now had a purpose. You can feel the intensity of his anticipation. Nights were restless, filled with thoughts of the man who had stolen his sister, of the justice that had eluded them for so long. Franklin traced every step of the investigation in his mind, imagining the moment that the science would speak, that the evidence would finally point to the person who had lived openly while his family suffered. Each day without news felt both unbearable and vital, as if the waiting itself was a test of endurance, a measure of his devotion to Sandra's memory. He spent hours at home and in libraries, absorbing every scrap of information about DNA and forensic breakthroughs. Even mundane chores were colored by the tension, the anticipation hovering in every corner of his life. Franklin's hope was not naive, it was fierce, built from 50 years of longing, frustration, and grief. He knew that the slightest breakthrough could shatter decades of despair, and he clung to that possibility with all the intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose. You can sense the fragile optimism that ran through him, a hope so precise and fragile it could be shattered with a single setback. Yet in that delicate thread of expectation lay the strength to endure, the commitment to see justice realized, and the silent promise to his mother and sister that their story would not be forgotten. For Franklin, hope had returned, burning brighter than the cold winds that had first claimed Sandra, and it would not be extinguished easily. The call from the lab arrived with a quiet finality. Cross listened as the technician explained the results. The hair and the button yielded nothing usable. No match, no breakthrough, no justice. For a moment, time seemed to stop. You can feel the weight pressing down, the air thick with the collapse of decades of hope. Franklin's excitement, painstakingly built over weeks and months, crumbled in an instant. The possibility of closure slipped through their fingers, leaving only frustration and aching disappointment. Detective Cross stared at the evidence box as if it had betrayed him. Every detail he had studied, every careful precaution, suddenly felt insufficient. He carried a personal burden, a guilt that grew with each passing hour. He knew the Miller family had pinned their faith on this fragile thread of science, and he feared he had failed them. Even the most logical mind struggles against the weight of emotional responsibility, and Cross felt it in every muscle, every thought. Franklin's world, built on anticipation, fell silent. The decades of pain, The years of waiting for a fragment of justice seemed heavier now than ever. You can sense the collective ache in Cheyenne. The community who had dared to hope, now staring at a void that refused to yield answers. The dreams of seeing the killer revealed, of restoring balance to their lives, had been dashed by the limits of technology. Cross could not hide from the truth. He had tried, but the era simply was not ready. Yet within that failure, a quiet determination lingered, a recognition that science would advance, that the story was not over. And you are left wondering, did the police give up too soon, or was the world simply not prepared to catch the man who had hidden in plain sight for 50 years? Do you think the police gave up too soon, or was technology simply not ready? Comment below. The streets of Cheyenne changed around you. New buildings rose where the old Western Union once stood. Neon signs flickered along modern storefronts, and cars newer than anything in 1969 navigated freshly paved roads. Life marched forward, but some shadows refused to move. The murder of Sandra Miller remained an invisible mark, etched into the city's memory, a wound that refused to heal. You can feel the city's heartbeat in transition, the hum of progress brushing against the frozen echo of that December night. Shops buzzed with commerce, schools filled with laughter, and families went about their daily routines, unaware of the ghost that lingered in the police archives. The Miller case was a relic, preserved in cardboard boxes and fading reports, untouched by time yet untouched by resolution. Detective Cross had long since retired, and younger officers patrolled streets that Sandra had walked. Each officer carried the weight of the past, some aware of the unsolved case, others oblivious. But the echoes of that blizzard night remained, carried in whispers among the older generation who remembered a young woman who vanished and a family left suspended in grief. You can feel the tension in how history and modernity collided. The town prospered, yet the question of who had stolen Sandra's life continued to hover over Cheyenne like frost, refusing to thaw. Families who had moved on still hesitated to speak aloud the story, afraid of awakening the pain that lingered in the quiet corners of their homes. The city moved forward, but the shadow of Sandra Miller lingered, frozen in memory and in evidence, waiting for the moment when someone would finally break through the decades of silence. Even as time blurred the streets, the people, and the lives of those left behind, you know the truth was still there. The evidence box, untouched and silent, held the key. A promise that the past was far from finished with the present. And in that waiting, you feel the weight of a story that refuses to fade. Dolores Miller aged in a quiet rhythm, her life slowed by grief that refused to let her move forward. Every corner of her home carried the weight of absence. Sandra's bedroom remained untouched, the bed still made with hospital corners, the Western Union supervisor's cap resting in its place, and the half-finished mystery novel waiting on the nightstand. Time had passed, but the loss had not. You can feel the emptiness in her days. Holidays came and went, each one a reminder of a daughter who would never return. Family meals were quieter, laughter muted by memories that refused to be silenced. Dolores's health waned, but her mind remained sharp, her resolve to see justice unwavering. She placed her trust in Franklin, the one who had carried the story of Sandra through decades of waiting. In her final days, she grasped his hand with a force that belied her frailty. Her voice, though weakened by years, carried the weight of half a century of unanswered questions. She whispered her last wish, that Franklin would not rest until the truth was uncovered, until the man who had stolen their lives was finally held accountable. That plea burned like fire, a commandment carved into the very core of him. You can feel the urgency in her words, the fear of dying without seeing justice fulfilled. Dolores left the world in 2005, her eyes closing without witnessing the arrest that would eventually come. Yet in her departure, she passed the torch to Franklin, ensuring that Sandra's story would not die with her. Every memory, every detail he held, was now a sacred responsibility. Even as the city of Cheyenne moved forward, even as modern life brushed past the grief-stricken corners of the Miller home, the final plea of Dolores Miller echoed through the years, and in that echo, you feel the tension of decades awaiting resolution, the knowledge that the past would not remain buried forever. Franklin Miller could not escape Sandra's absence. Every day, every memory, reminded him of a life stolen before it had begun. He devoted hours to the case, poring over old reports, newspaper clippings, and every detail he could uncover about that December night. Each fact became a thread he clutched tightly, hoping it would lead him closer to the man who had robbed their family of peace. You can feel the intensity in his obsession. His home, once a place of routine comfort, now carried the air of investigation. He organized notes, tracked leads, and cross-referenced events with meticulous care. Even casual conversations sparked memories or clues, and Franklin found himself analyzing the world through the lens of unanswered questions. Every shadow, every unfamiliar face on the street, could be a connection, a reminder that the killer had walked freely while their lives were frozen in grief. Time pressed on, yet Franklin refused to let it dull his focus. Friends and colleagues observed his fixation. Some concerned, others inspired by his unwavering dedication. He moved through life with the memory of Sandra as both anchor and compass, feeling the weight of decades in every step. Sleep was often broken by dreams of that fateful blizzard night, of her Mustang abandoned in the snow, and of the unanswered questions that lingered like frost in the air. You can sense the tension that grew with each passing year. Franklin's fixation was not idle. It was the fuel that kept hope alive, the engine behind a story waiting to be concluded. Every detail he uncovered, every piece of history he preserved, brought him closer to the moment when justice would finally pierce the decades of silence. Through his eyes, you feel the enduring pain, the relentless pursuit, and the unyielding belief that the truth, no matter how long buried, would not remain hidden forever. And it is in this fixation that the quiet promise of resolution waits, just beyond reach, ready to shatter the long-held shadows of Cheyenne. The younger generation of Cheyenne grew up hearing little of Sandra Miller. Her story became a name on a plaque, a memory fading in history books and family tales. Life moved on. New businesses, schools, and neighborhoods replaced the old city, and the murder that had haunted the town for decades drifted quietly from conversations. The city prospered, yet the shadow of a life stolen lingered in the edges, unnoticed by those too young to remember the blizzard or the abandoned Mustang. You can feel the tension in how easily memory can fade, how even the most profound loss can be swallowed by time when no answers come. Franklin carried Sandra in every thought, every breath, but the world around him moved forward, indifferent to the decades of silence. Each day without progress was a reminder that justice remained just out of reach. The grief was compounded by the realization that her name could slip from memory, leaving only an empty story in a town too busy to remember. Yet, in the quiet of the police archives, the evidence box waited. Dust settled over it, but inside were fragments of a past that refused to die. A single dark button, hair samples frozen in time, and notes that held the whispers of a murder that had defied 50 years. That box carried the potential to shatter lives, to reveal truths that had remained hidden while the city slept. Every year that passed without resolution made its contents heavier, the tension inside it more unbearable, the promise of revelation sharper. We've seen many long, cold cases, but few survive 5 decades. And this one, with its frozen clues and unanswered questions, was about to speak. The city may have forgotten, but the truth does not forget. Franklin's dedication, the evidence that patiently waited, and the science that had yet to be unleashed, all held the power to restore justice, to finally bring an ending to a story that had been frozen in shadow for far too long. You feel it in the silence, the weight of waiting, and the knowledge that patience can turn into revelation. This was the moment the past was poised to confront the present, and nothing could remain hidden forever. Detective Wyatt Sterling leaned back in his chair, staring at the Miller file as if the decades of silence could speak to him. The office was windowless, the hum of the air conditioner, the only sound, yet the weight of 54 years, pressed against every wall. You can feel his obsession in how he traced every line of the case, memorizing dates, names, and the faintest details. This was no ordinary investigation. It was a promise to Sandra, to Dolores, to Franklin, that the story would finally be completed. You can sense his frustration with the limits of the past. Standard DNA tests had failed decades ago, and traditional investigative methods had yielded nothing. Sterling's mind worked differently. He belonged to an era where evidence could live in the smallest fragment, where a single hair, a solitary skin cell, could reveal truths that had eluded the world for half a century. The Miller case became more than a file on a shelf. It was a mission, a personal burden he could not set down. He traced the details of the blizzard, the abandoned Mustang, the freight car where Sandra's life ended, and the evidence that had waited in the shadows for decades. You can feel the tension in how Sterling's fingers lingered over the box containing the dark button and the preserved hair. Each item was a key. Each key a potential door to justice long delayed. Sterling whispered into the empty room, a low promise carried on the still air. Time to wake up, Sandra. The words weren't for the dead, they were a challenge to the past, a warning that no crime remained hidden forever. You can feel the anticipation, the weight of decades converging in a single moment. The files, the evidence, and Sterling's unrelenting focus set the stage for a breakthrough no one in Cheyenne had imagined. And in that silence, you understand that the next steps would not just resolve a cold case, they would awaken a ghost that had been waiting patiently for 54 years. Sterling knew the answers could no longer come from traditional methods. The old hair samples and the dark button had slept in a box for decades. But now, technology offered a chance. He reached out to a laboratory specializing in forensic investigative genetic genealogy, or FIGG, a method that could extract DNA from even the tiniest traces and trace it through public ancestry databases. You can feel the excitement and tension as he prepared the samples. FIG wasn't magic. It required patience, precision, and a deep understanding of genetics. A single cell could carry the story of a family tree, connecting distant relatives and narrowing the path to a single individual. Sterling watched the lab's instructions carefully, ensuring every strand of hair and every fragment of material was preserved, uncontaminated, and ready to tell its story. If you're still watching at this point, you might as well subscribe so you don't miss the next one. He sent the evidence with a mix of hope and anxiety, knowing that decades of waiting were compressed into the fragile envelope traveling to Texas. The process was simple to explain but profound in impact. The lab would extract DNA, build a genomic profile, and then compare it to existing ancestry records. Any match, even with distant relatives, could reveal the lineage of the unknown killer. You can sense the stakes in how Sterling moved through the office afterward. He reviewed old photographs, reread statements, and imagined the possibilities. Each distant cousin found in the database could be a clue. Each match a stepping stone toward uncovering the man who had haunted Cheyenne for 54 years. FIG was more than a technique. It was a bridge between decades. A method that could finally shine a light on a killer who had hidden in plain sight. And in that moment, you feel the tension coiling tight, the sense that the past and the present were about to collide. Every second of waiting became unbearable, yet necessary, because the truth required precision, patience, and the courage to confront the shadows of history. Sterling waited, and the silence stretched on. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still, there was nothing. The hum of the office became a constant reminder of time passing without answers. The quiet, amplifying the weight of decades of grief. You can feel the tension in each tick of the clock, every moment a reminder of how long Sandra had been waiting for justice. He replayed every detail of the case in his mind. The blizzard, the abandoned Mustang, the freight car where her life ended it all, haunted him in ways that sometimes made it difficult to breathe. Each call from the lab was a flicker of hope. Each day without news a sharp edge against the heart. Franklin's decades of vigilance now mirrored Sterling's own obsession, a shared burden across generations. You sense the intensity as he monitored the progress, checking emails, reviewing communications, and imagining the possibilities with each passing day. The smallest glimmer of hope became a lifeline, and each delay a crushing weight. Sterling understood the stakes not only for Franklin but for the city that had long forgotten the young woman whose life had been stolen. The anticipation of a breakthrough twisted in the pit of his stomach, a tension that refused to loosen. 3 months of waiting felt like a lifetime compressed into empty hours. You feel the strain, the emotional weight of knowing that a single notification could shatter decades of silence, that one small fragment of DNA might finally reveal the face of the man who had lived among them, untouched, for 54 years. And then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, the sound of a notification pierced the stillness. Sterling's heart raced. Every step of the journey, every hour of obsession, had led to this moment. The silence ended. The past was about to speak. The notification blinked on Sterling's screen, a single line of text that carried the weight of 54 years. The lab had done the impossible. From the tiny fragments of skin trapped in the button, a full genomic profile had been extracted. You can feel the electricity in the room, the sudden surge of hope and fear coiling tight in his chest. This was the moment when decades of silence would be confronted. The profile didn't immediately point to the killer, it pointed to his relatives. Distant cousins, a great-aunt, a half-brother long past. Each match was a thread, a path winding back toward the man who had haunted Cheyenne's memories. Sterling worked quickly, cross-referencing names, locations, and ages, constructing a sprawling family tree that spanned generations. You can feel the tension building with every connection, each one narrowing the list, bringing the elusive figure into focus. Sterling traced the tree meticulously, watching as hundreds of names slowly became 50, then 10, then 3. Each narrowing step heightened the stakes, the anticipation a tangible presence in the room. This was not just a breakthrough, it was the culmination of decades of grief, obsession, and unanswered questions finally aligning. You feel the weight of history pressing against every second. Then, the software highlighted a single name, glowing with undeniable certainty. The man who had lived in plain sight, a fixture of the community, was no longer anonymous. The DNA did not lie. Justice had found a voice in a cell smaller than a grain of sand. Most people don't know how one hidden cell can expose a killer. Stay tuned. Sterling leaned back, heart hammering, and realized the chase was no longer in the past. The decades of waiting, the pain, the obsession, they were about to collide with a truth that would shock a town and rewrite a life that had been frozen for over half a century. You can feel it. The past was awakening, and nothing would remain hidden. Sterling knew he couldn't do this alone. The complexity of the genealogy, the decades of fragmented connections, demanded someone who could see patterns where he only saw fragments. Penny Gable was that person. Her expertise in tracing familial lines through public and private records made her the perfect partner. You can feel the intensity as they spread old documents across the table, scanned photographs of distant relatives, and mapped connections that spanned generations. Every name, every birth date, every location mattered. Penny worked methodically, her eyes scanning microfiche, online databases, and census reports. Sterling supplied the DNA matches, tiny clues that pointed to distant cousins, great-aunts, half-siblings long past. Together, they became an unrelenting force, piecing together the puzzle that 54 years of silence had left behind. You sensed the urgency in their collaboration, each breakthrough a step closer to exposing a man who had hidden in plain sight for decades. They argued over details, debated the weight of a single connection, and celebrated minor victories that brought them one step closer to the truth. Every discovery, no matter how small, added tension. You feel Sterling's obsession mirrored in Penny's dedication, the two of them navigating a labyrinth of names and dates, with the singular goal of bringing justice to Sandra. Late nights turned into early mornings. Coffee cups piled up, fingers ached from endless scrolling, and the evidence of time and patience lay in the ever-expanding network of names. Yet every thread they pulled tightened the web around the killer. You can feel the anticipation, the sense that each connection could finally reveal the man who had tormented Cheyenne in silence for more than 5 decades. The stakes were high. They weren't just tracing a family tree, they were unmasking a predator. And with every line drawn, every relationship confirmed, the truth edged closer, inching toward a name that would shock a town. A man who had lived among them as if untouched by time. The family tree grew like a sprawling map of secrets, each branch connecting lives Sterling had never imagined. Hundreds of names filled the digital canvas. Ancestors and descendants spanning decades. You can feel the tension as they traced marriages, relocations, and deaths. Each connection a possible path to the man who had hidden behind decades of trust and familiarity. Sterling and Penny worked tirelessly, eliminating dead ends and focusing on the nodes that mattered. Each distant cousin discovered in the database was a clue, a signpost pointing to the heart of the mystery. You feel their obsession as they cross-referenced addresses, checked military records, and verified dates of birth. Every new detail heightened the stakes, each revelation sharpening the image of the elusive figure they pursued. The tree wasn't just names on a screen, it was a living, breathing web of relationships, a record of a family's history stretching across states and decades. They noticed patterns, geographic clusters, and family traits that had been hidden in plain sight. Sterling's pulse quickened as connections began to converge, hints of the final link that would expose the man who had stolen a life and hidden behind decades of respectability. Time became irrelevant. The hours stretched into nights, nights into early mornings. The office filled with the quiet hum of computers, the occasional rustle of papers, the sharp intake of breath whenever a promising lead appeared. You sensed the urgency, the pressure mounting as every thread they followed narrowed the possibilities. Each breakthrough felt like pulling a cord, drawing them closer to the truth, tightening the web around the killer. Penny's steady guidance and Sterling's relentless drive merged into a single, unstoppable force. The suspense built with every verified connection, every eliminated suspect, every narrowing branch. And then, as the tree began to solidify, a pattern emerged. A convergence that pointed unmistakably toward one part of Cheyenne, one branch of a family that had long held secrets buried in the shadows of history. You can feel the anticipation rising. The killer's identity was close, the final reveal almost within reach. The list of possible suspects began to shrink, and with every elimination, the tension became unbearable. From hundreds of names, they reduced the field to 50, then 10, then 3. Each narrowing step brought them closer to the man who had eluded justice for more than half a century. You can feel Sterling's pulse quicken, the weight of decades pressing down with every connection confirmed, every branch of the family tree meticulously traced. They checked locations, ages, and histories, cross-referencing every detail with the cold, hard facts of December 1969. Each candidate was examined, every footprint scrutinized, every life analyzed. The sense of urgency was tangible, time felt suspended, and yet the past was closing in like a predator circling its prey. You feel the anticipation tighten as each potential suspect was eliminated, leaving only the most probable. Sterling's eyes never left the screen. Penny's notes covered the desk in a chaotic mosaic of names and dates. They spoke in hushed tones, debating the plausibility of each lead. Every name removed brought relief and dread in equal measure. Relief that they were closer, dread because the truth was about to break, and nothing could prepare them for the shock of finally seeing the final name emerge. And then, it was there. The single name that had slipped through the cracks for 54 years. The name that belonged to a man who had walked Cheyenne streets, greeted neighbors, taught children, and lived among the unsuspecting town. Sterling felt the air tighten around him, the gravity of the discovery pressing down with unrelenting force. You sensed the weight of the decades, the lives altered, the grief endured, all converging on a single revelation. 3 candidates had been whittled down to 1. The final name glowed on the screen, undeniable, irreversible, and devastating. The man who had hidden behind respectability, the predator disguised as a citizen, had finally been identified. The moment was electric, charged with disbelief and horror. The reveal was coming, and the truth would shock a community to its core. Arthur Penhaligon. The name appeared on Sterling's screen, glowing with a weight that made the room feel impossibly small. You feel the disbelief, the tension snapping like a wire, as a man who had lived openly in the community for decades was suddenly revealed as the predator hiding in plain sight. Sterling's chest tightened. This wasn't a stranger, a drifter, or someone lurking on the outskirts of Cheyenne. This was a man who had walked among them, taught their children, and earned their trust. The reality hit harder than any snowstorm from the night Sandra disappeared. You can feel Sterling's pulse quicken, his mind racing through 54 years of unanswered questions, of grief and obsession, now converging on this one terrifying truth. Every interaction, every smile Penhaligon had offered the community now carried a shadow that chilled the blood. This was the neighbor, the teacher, the man whose image had never been questioned until now. Sterling leaned back, absorbing the gravity of the discovery. The painstaking genealogical work, the countless hours of cross-referencing, had led to this single point. The truth was undeniable, carved into the fabric of decades-old DNA, finally catching up with the man who had taken so much. You feel the shock reverberate, the kind that leaves a town speechless, questioning everything they thought they knew about the world around them. A respected teacher, a hidden predator. Did anyone ever suspect him? What do you think? Sterling exhaled slowly, feeling the tension shift from uncertainty to purpose. The work was not over, but the breakthrough had been made. The man who had caused decades of pain had a name, a face, a history that could no longer hide behind time. The revelation was devastating, electric, and utterly irreversible. This moment was the turning point, the final curtain beginning to rise on the half-century-long story of loss, obsession, and a predator finally unmasked. The morning was calm, deceptively ordinary. October sunlight slanted across the tree-lined street, highlighting neat lawns and quiet homes. You could almost hear the stillness pressing against the walls, the hum of distant traffic, the faint clatter of a newspaper landing on a porch. This neighborhood had always been a place of comfort, where the unthinkable was never expected. And then, 4 black SUVs rolled silently into view, breaking the calm with a presence that felt like thunder. You can feel the tension as the vehicles parked strategically, doors clicked open, and a team of plainclothes officers fanned out. Sterling led them, each step deliberate, his eyes fixed on the modest bungalow that had housed the man whose secrets had haunted Cheyenne for more than 50 years. Neighbors paused mid-sip of coffee, mid-shovel of snow from sidewalks, mid-conversation with children. Some pressed against windows, others stepped cautiously into their yards. You can sense their disbelief, the sudden intrusion of danger into a street that had always felt safe. Whispers moved quickly, growing louder with every movement of the team. What's going on? Is this real? Who? The quiet was fractured further as Sterling approached the front door. Each footstep felt amplified, echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. You feel the weight of decades pressing down, the anticipation that the calm, the trust, and the innocence of this street were about to be broken. Every neighbor, every onlooker, could feel the gravity in the air. This was no ordinary visit, and through the murmurs, the collective breath of the neighborhood seemed to hold as the officers prepared to confront the man who had walked among them undetected for 54 years. The moment was electric, silent, and suffocating all at once. A storm of revelation was about to strike, and nothing would ever feel safe here again. The door opened, and there he stood. Arthur Penhaligon, calm, composed, the very image of a kind, trustworthy neighbor. Wire-rimmed glasses, thinning silver hair, a cardigan that suggested comfort rather than threat. You can feel the contrast instantly, the gentle man everyone trusted, now facing the weight of 54 years of secrets. His eyes, once warm, now flicked with a hint of confusion as Sterling spoke his name. Arthur Penhaligon, Sterling said, his voice low, carrying authority that left no room for misinterpretation. You are under arrest for the first-degree murder of Sandra Miller on the 14th of December, 1969. You feel the immediate shift, the tension snapping like a cord. Arthur's calm facade faltered. Color drained from his face, replaced by a stark, raw disbelief. The polite greeting, the mild confusion, all evaporated under the weight of the words. Every careful step, every decade of respectability, began to crumble in an instant. For a moment, the street seemed to hold its breath. You sensed the collective shock radiating outward, neighbors frozen, staring, unable to reconcile the man they had known with the predator the law had just named. Sterling watched, unflinching, as Arthur's shoulders slumped slightly, the first visible crack in the armor of a lifetime of deception. The officers moved with precision, quietly guiding him back into the house. Every motion was controlled, methodical, yet the sense of inevitability hung like a storm cloud. You can feel the realization pressing down on everyone present. The predator had never hidden in the shadows. He had lived in plain sight, teaching, volunteering, smiling at community events, while the town carried a weight of grief, ignorance, and unknowing trust. This was the moment where safety fractured, where disbelief collided with truth, where a community came face to face with decades of deception. The quiet street would never feel ordinary again. The news traveled faster than the winter wind. Word spread from windows, yards, and driveways as neighbors whispered, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. You can feel the disbelief ripple through the community, the shock hitting harder with every passing second. The man they had known, trusted, smiled at, and learned from, was the same one responsible for the terror that had haunted Cheyenne for over half a century. Former students peeked from behind curtains, recognizing a face they had once respected, now marked with guilt and arrest. You feel the raw emotion of betrayal that cut deeper than any blizzard ever could. Parents shook their heads in stunned horror, recalling the man who had once volunteered with children at the local youth center. Every memory was now laced with suspicion and fear. On social media, photos of Arthur Penhaligon from school events, charity functions, and community ceremonies were posted, shared, and dissected. The town's collective conscience reeled. You can feel the emotional upheaval as the truth sank in decades of trust shattered, innocence lost, and a predator exposed in plain sight. Conversations erupted in hushed tones, some in disbelief, others in anger, all struggling to process the enormity of what had finally come to light. The arrest ignited more than gossip. It reopened old wounds, confronting the grief that had been frozen since 1969. You sensed the town holding its breath, caught between relief and outrage. Justice had finally arrived, but at a cost. The community faced a reckoning, forced to reconcile decades of memories with the horrifying reality. And in the midst of it, you feel the tension, the fear, and the anger coalesce into a single, undeniable truth. Evil had walked among them, hidden behind the most ordinary of facades. The shock was absolute, the lesson painful, and the story far from over. You can feel the weight pressing down on every street, every home, every person who had known him. The calm, polite man, the teacher, the volunteer. He had walked past families, neighbors, and friends for decades, carrying a darkness no one could see. The realization is suffocating. You sense how easy it is for danger to hide behind a friendly face, to blend into ordinary life while committing acts no one could have imagined. Sterling watched him carefully, noting the flickers of resistance, the brief attempts to reclaim control. You feel the tension tighten as the officers move quietly, leaving no room for error. This isn't a simple arrest. It is the culmination of 54 years of unanswered questions, grief, and obsession finally colliding with truth. The calm of the morning has been replaced by a storm of revelation, and the air is electric with the shock of discovery. The neighborhood, once serene and trusting, now pulses with a mix of horror and disbelief. You feel the fear ripple outward. The fragile sense of security that everyone had taken for granted is gone. Parents hold their children closer. Former students glance at each other with unease, and the quiet streets carry the weight of unspoken dread. The predator had lived openly, and the town is only now coming to terms with that reality. And you understand, more than ever, the danger of invisible threats. She never saw danger in his eyes, and neither did anyone else. The revelation is far from complete, and Sterling knows it. The story has only reached this stage. The confession, the details, and the full account of that blizzard night still await. Stay with the truth, stay with the unraveling, because the next chapter will strip away every last illusion. Every secret, every act, every decision will be exposed, leaving nothing untouched. The next moments will show how justice, no matter how delayed, finally demands its due. Arthur sits across from Sterling, hands folded calmly on the table, a quiet confidence in his posture. You feel the tension immediately, thick in the air. For decades, he perfected this mask, the polite teacher, the community volunteer, the man everyone trusted. Now, under the relentless gaze of Sterling, that mask begins to tremble. I don't recall, he says softly, voice steady but empty. 54 years of practice have gone into this calm, forgetful act, and you sense the careful construction of every word. He believes that time could shield him from truth, that decades could erase accountability. But Sterling doesn't waver. You feel the weight of inevitability pressing down, a force that knows no compromise. Every glance, every pause, every small gesture becomes a window into his hidden self. The room feels smaller, tighter, charged with the unspoken knowledge that the years of lies are about to collapse. You feel the predator lurking just beneath the surface, the danger once hidden now inching closer to exposure. Sterling leans forward, eyes locking onto Arthur, and pulls out a photograph. You see it, the image of Sandra Miller, smiling, alive, unaware of the horror that would end her life. The photograph becomes a silent weapon, a mirror reflecting decades of theft from her life. Do you recognize her? Sterling asks, voice low but commanding. The calm, polite facade begins to falter. You feel the shift in the room, the subtle tremor of fear, the sudden edge of confusion, the dawning awareness that the act he thought forgotten is now fully seen. The carefully constructed mask cracks, revealing the man who has lived half a century alongside the horror he created. You feel the first ripple of justice in the air, a tangible pull toward revelation. The predator cannot hide any longer. The past is closing in, and the truth is about to rise. The photograph rests on the table, and you can feel the room tighten as Arthur's eyes flicker, tracing the familiar face of Sandra Miller. The gentle, forgetful elder you saw moments ago wavers. His calm, polite exterior begins to falter under the weight of recognition. You sense the shift. The predator, hidden for decades, is stirring. Sterling leans closer, voice quiet but unyielding. You know her, he says. You remember the night she disappeared. You feel the tension spike, a visible tremor passing through Arthur as the reality of the decades-long deception presses down. Every heartbeat, every breath, carries the weight of truth, finally catching up. Arthur swallows, a brief, involuntary gesture that betrays the composure he had relied on for 54 years. You can see it in the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the tightening of his jaw. The carefully constructed image of a harmless, respected elder begins to crumble. There is no room left for pretense. Sterling's eyes never leave him, and you feel the unspoken understanding that nothing will let him slip away this time. You notice the subtle panic flicker. He knows the act, once buried under years and snow, is fully exposed. The predator, once invisible in the light of normal life, now sits naked under scrutiny, and every lie, every omission, every decade of pretending is laid bare. He shifts in his seat, trying to regain composure, but the change is irreversible. You feel the room exhale with a slow, inevitable acknowledgement. The man who taught children, volunteered in his community, smiled for photographs. He is the same man who stole a life and carried it in silence. You see it, the collapse of 54 years of concealment. The predator is revealed. The carefully maintained facade is gone, leaving the stark, cold truth. The danger that walked alongside you all these years is finally facing the consequences. Arthur's eyes dart briefly to the photograph, then back to Sterling. You feel the room constrict as the weight of 54 years of silence begins to press on him. The careful, polite exterior is gone, replaced by a flicker of something raw: regret, fear, and the faintest glimmer of inevitability. Sterling doesn't speak. He lets the tension build, letting the truth force its way out. The first words are slow, deliberate, almost rehearsed. I watched her for weeks. I couldn't stop myself. You feel the horror and obsession wrapped tightly in those few words. Every sentence that follows is measured, but the emotional intensity is unmistakable. Arthur recounts the night, the snow, the wind, the way he followed her from the telegraph office. He admits to cornering her when she stepped out to clear her windshield. You can feel the panic that overtook him when she fought back, the sudden, irrevocable decision that ended her life. He describes the cover of the blizzard, how it seemed to hide everything, how he thought the wind and snow would erase the act. You feel the chilling calculation, the way normality returned after the crime: decades of smiling, teaching, volunteering. Every word exposes the methodical obsession, not the gore, but the intent, the control, and the years spent carrying the secret. Sterling listens unflinching as the predator finally admits what the town never imagined, that a man so trusted, so visible in daily life, had harbored this dark compulsion. You feel the intensity of decades collapsing in moments, the revelation stripping away the last protective layers of deceit. Arthur's confession is not a story of brutality alone. It is a story of obsession, of time, of the consequences of hiding in plain sight. You can sense the release in telling, the burden lifting as truth is finally spoken aloud, and you feel the room charged with the power of accountability long delayed. Arthur leans back, the confession lingering in the air like frost over Cheyenne. You feel the weight of decades compress into this single room, every unspoken detail now accounted for. Sterling sits across from him, calm but relentless, letting the silence press. The evidence, the photograph, the genealogical proof, they all converge here, and you can feel the inevitability of justice closing in. The years of concealment, the smiling faces in classrooms, the community events, the volunteer work, they crumble in this moment. You sense the stark contrast between the life he led and the life he stole. Every lie, every omission, every carefully maintained secret falls away. There is no escape now. The predator has been stripped bare. Arthur's voice is quieter now, almost reflective, and you can hear the faint tremor of defeat. He acknowledges the decades of deception, the careful facade, the false normality. He admits the obsession that drove him, the choice that changed Sandra's life forever. You feel the room tighten again, a visceral connection to the consequences of hidden evil. Sterling allows the confession to settle, letting it resonate fully. You can feel the emotional release in the air, the tension uncoiling as truth meets accountability. The predator has finally spoken, and the weight of 54 years of unanswered questions begins to lift from the town, from the family, from history itself. Every piece of evidence, every genealogical connection, every shred of DNA, now validated, stands as a monument to patience, persistence, and the refusal to forget. You feel the finality of decades of pursuit, the closure that was once thought impossible. Arthur Penhaligon, the man who walked among the living while harboring this shadow, has no words left. The secrets are gone, the confession is complete, and you feel, finally, that the story, long frozen in time, has reached its reckoning. You feel the room settle after the confession, yet the unease lingers. 54 years of silence ended, but the shadow of what went unseen resonates deeply. You realize the danger that can hide behind the kindest smile, the neighborliest gestures. Every person you meet carries a story, and some are darker than you could ever imagine. Think about the people around you, the ones who greet you warmly, the ones who volunteer, the ones everyone trusts. Could they be hiding a secret? Could a danger pass your doorway tonight, unrecognized, unnoticed? That weight, that uncertainty, is what the town of Cheyenne carried for decades. And now, as the predator is unmasked, you feel a shiver. An acute awareness that appearances are not enough. The confession, the DNA, the genealogical breakthroughs. They are proof that truth can wait decades, but never disappears. You feel the power of persistence, of investigation, of refusing to let time erase accountability. And yet, there's a warning in this story, a reminder that evil can exist quietly, patiently, for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. You recognize, as Franklin and the town did, that awareness matters, vigilance matters, and understanding that darkness can hide in plain sight becomes a lesson in caution, in empathy, in the relentless pursuit of justice. This is more than a story of one life taken too soon. It's a story that reminds you how fragile trust can be, and how persistent hope can finally reveal truth. If you're not subscribing yet, tell me why in the comments. I want to hear it. Engage with this story. Reflect on what you would have done if you were Dolores, if you were Franklin, if you were the detective who never gave up. Share your thoughts, and let the echoes of Cheyenne's long winter remind us all. Justice may take decades, but it arrives in full force. The morning air bites at your cheeks as you walk through the frost-laden streets of Cheyenne. Each step crunches against frozen grass, echoing the years of unanswered questions and silent nights. You can almost feel the weight of 54 winters pressing on your shoulders, every memory of Sandra's absence pressing in with the cold. The town is quiet, subdued, as if it too is holding its breath, waiting for what comes next. You remember the long nights spent poring over old newspapers, flipping through microfiche, trying to catch a glimpse of a clue, a trace of the man who shattered your family. Every step toward the cemetery carries that history, that anger, that grief that never left. You think of your mother, Dolores, keeping Sandra's room unchanged, the bed made perfectly, the nightstand holding the half-finished book, as if freezing time could hold back the loss. The path to the wrought iron gates feels longer than it should. Each footfall stirs the cold wind, whispering through the bare branches above. You feel the decades of tension in every muscle, every heartbeat. There's fear too, not for yourself, but for the reckoning of a story left unresolved for so long. You reach the entrance and pause, letting the moment settle. The snow glistens faintly under the early sun, and the graves lie in patient rows, waiting. The names etched into stone, some familiar, some distant, remind you that history has been watching, silent, for half a century. And then, standing before the final gate, you whisper to yourself, to your sister, to your mother words that have waited 54 years to be said. The weight of the past presses down, but something else begins to stir. The possibility that this walk, this moment, might finally lift it. You kneel before the cold granite, the engraved names staring back at you like ghosts who have waited patiently for this moment. You speak their names aloud, Sandra, Dolores, letting the sound carry over the frost-touched ground. For decades, you held these words in your chest, unspoken, reserved for a moment that finally arrived. Now, they escape, raw and trembling, a release of grief too long contained. You tell Sandra about the years she missed, the milestones she never saw. You speak of graduations, of weddings, of children she never held. Your voice breaks as you describe the weight of emptiness her absence left behind, the hollow places in the family that no holiday or gathering could fill. You tell her about your mother, how she guarded the memory of her daughter like a fragile flame, how she kept her room untouched, a shrine to a life stolen too soon. You speak as if she can answer, as if the wind itself will carry your words back to her. You recount your frustration, your obsession, the nights spent chasing shadows, the questions that haunted every corner of your life. And then, slowly, your voice shifts. The words of anger turn to words of remembrance, words of love. You share the laughter you recall, the warmth she brought to the office, to the streets of Cheyenne, to your life. Every syllable is a step toward release, toward healing. Tears streak your face, mingling grief with relief, raw emotions spilling into the crisp winter air. The past presses against you, but for the first time in decades, you feel the pressure lessen. Speaking, acknowledging, Remembering, these simple acts are a bridge between loss and the quiet hope that justice, long delayed, has finally arrived. The first real breath comes in heavy, shaking gulps, as if the weight of 54 years is finally lifting from your chest. You feel it in your limbs, a trembling that is both exhaustion and relief, a release that has been decades in the making. The cold winter air does little to touch the fire of emotion coursing through you. Memories rise unbidden, some sharp and painful, others warm and bittersweet. You remember Sandra's laugh echoing through the telegraph office, the way she'd paused to notice small acts of kindness, the brightness she brought into rooms that felt otherwise dim. You feel the emptiness that lingered in her absence begin to ease, replaced by a fragile sense of closure. Your grief mingles with relief, a strange combination that leaves you both heavy and light. You recognize how long you carried the weight of unanswered questions, the obsession with finding a truth that seemed always just out of reach. Now, each beat of your heart feels like permission to let go, to acknowledge sorrow without letting it consume every thought, every step forward. Tears fall freely, the sky above silent witness to decades of pain now meeting its counterbalance. The cold wind brushes your cheeks, but it no longer feels oppressive. It carries with it a strange comfort, a reminder that even after the harshest winters, warmth can return. For the first time in years, you feel the possibility of life without the constant shadow of anger, without the heavy tether of helplessness. The past is acknowledged, the injustice confronted, and in this delicate balance of grief and relief, you begin to feel something that has long eluded you, the first stirrings of peace. You rise from the granite, letting the quiet of the cemetery settle around you. The winter sun glints off the frost, illuminating rows of markers, each one a reminder that life moves forward, even through grief. As you walk back through the gates, you sense the subtle shift in the town itself, as if Cheyenne has collectively exhaled, finally able to release the weight of decades-long sorrow. Neighbors you have known for years nod in recognition, their eyes reflecting relief and shared emotion. The news of the arrest and the closure it brings ripples through the community, softening the edges of fear and distrust that had lingered silently in conversations and at dinner tables. The conversations that follow are quieter, but heavier with meaning. People begin to speak of Sandra in a voice that acknowledges both the tragedy and the justice that has finally arrived. In schools, the story becomes more than a warning. It is a testament to resilience, to the pursuit of truth, and to the patience required when justice sleeps for too long. Friends of your family reach out, sharing memories of Sandra, painting pictures of the warmth she carried with her, the small acts of kindness that had gone unnoticed until now. You feel the town's collective grief slowly softening, replaced by cautious hope. There is a newfound sense that even in the harshest winters, light can return, that stories once frozen in fear can thaw into lessons for all. Cheyenne begins to feel alive again, aware that the past has been acknowledged and the wounds addressed, if only partially. Walking through streets you've known all your life, you realize the town itself is healing alongside you. The air feels lighter, the silence less oppressive, and for the first time in decades, you understand that closure is not just personal. It is a balm for a community that has lived too long in shadow. You kneel once more, this time not in despair, but in quiet reverence. The words you speak are measured, heavy with memory, yet carried on a current of release. "We got him, Sandy," you whisper, your voice cracking, trembling with the weight of 54 winters. The names of your mother and sister roll off your tongue like a prayer finally answered. Each syllable, a promise that their lives are honored and remembered. You recount your journey, the decades spent tracing shadows, questioning every stranger, every clue, every false hope. You speak aloud the fear, the anger, the helplessness that gripped you for so long. And then, slowly, your tone shifts. Relief interlaces with sorrow, grief softens into remembrance, and the heaviness that once defined your every step begins to lift. You lay a single yellow rose on the cold granite, its color a sharp, living contrast to the winter around you. It is an offering, a symbol that even in the harshest of times, Beauty, memory, and justice endure. You pause, letting the silence envelop you, feeling for the first time that the past's relentless hold has loosened. Your final words are quiet but resolute, a testament to the endurance of love over cruelty. Mom, we got him, you say, letting the names linger, letting them anchor the moment. The truth has arrived, and with it, a sense of balance long denied. As you rise and step away, the air feels different. The cemetery, once a place of weight and sorrow, now carries the faintest hint of peace. And in that delicate shift, you understand that justice, long delayed, has finally been served, and the story of Sandra Miller, the girl who never came home, has reached its hard-won conclusion. For decades, he walked among you, the man who stole a life, shattered a family, and hid a monstrous secret was not a stranger lurking in dark alleys. He was the one who smiled at the local diner, the one you trusted with your children in school halls, the one whose polite nod never betrayed the darkness beneath. You saw a neighbor, a teacher, a member of your community, but you never saw him. You imagined the countless conversations, the small gestures, the casual appearances of normalcy, and realized the truth. Evil often wears the face of the familiar. Trust can blind you. Familiarity can lull you into believing safety exists where it does not. And for 54 years, this trust kept him hidden. His very presence was the camouflage that allowed him to evade detection, to live a life of quiet deception, while the pain of one young woman's death echoed through generations. You might ask yourself how you could have missed it. How could a man so ordinary, so approachable, carry such a devastating secret? The answer is simple. Monsters do not always shout. Sometimes they sit quietly in classrooms, volunteer at youth centers, and shake the hands of those who respect them. The quiet ones can hurt the most because no one suspects them, and when the crime is revealed, disbelief mixes with rage. This is the lesson that lingers over Cheyenne. Appearances deceive. The people you let into your daily life, the faces you trust, may conceal shadows you cannot perceive. And yet, even in the darkest concealment, the truth waits patiently, quietly building its own reckoning. Stay alert. The truth can be closer than you think. Sandra Miller was more than a name on a cold case file. She was warmth in a frozen city, a thread of light through the harsh winter of Cheyenne. Her laughter lingered in her family's home. Her voice carried through the telegraph office, and her presence was a daily reminder of what it meant to care, to connect, and to be alive. For decades, her story existed in fragments, memories held by those who loved her, whispered warnings in the streets, and the frozen silence of a bedroom that never changed. Her absence shaped the lives of everyone who knew her. Franklin carried her memory like a shadow, a constant weight of grief mixed with the hope that one day her story would be told in full. Each photograph, each keepsake, each small recollection became a testament to the life she led and the family she anchored. Her mother, Dolores, kept her room untouched, a shrine to both love and loss, until her own passing. Sandra's life was paused, but it was never forgotten. Even the city could not erase her impact. The stories told in hushed tones, the warnings to children, the shared understanding that something tragic had occurred, all of it kept her presence alive. Cheyenne remembered her as the girl who never came home. But now, 54 years later, it remembers her as the woman she was, a vibrant, capable, caring human being whose life mattered. Her legacy is not only in memory but in the justice finally achieved. The truth of her final moments, the exposure of the man who hid among the unsuspecting, ensures that Sandra Miller is no longer a ghost of tragedy. She is a symbol of resilience, of the patience of justice, and of the enduring need to honor the lives taken too soon. Justice can take its time. It can crawl through decades, carried by the hands of those unwilling to let a story fade. Sandra's case proved that truth does not vanish, even under layers of snow, silence, and the passing of generations. For 54 years, the city slept while the killer moved freely among the people he betrayed, confident that time had shielded him. Yet, The smallest detail, the thread on a button, a cell trapped in fabric, waited patiently for the day it would speak louder than any witness, louder than any rumor, louder than the frozen streets themselves. When Detective Wyatt Sterling held that evidence, he did not merely hold remnants of a crime. He held the key to decades of grief and unanswered questions. Each painstaking step of genealogy, each cross-referenced record, and every sleepless night led to a single moment where time itself bent to reveal the truth. The killer could no longer hide behind ordinary appearances or the comfort of a community's trust. What had been stolen, the sense of safety, the years of mourning, the chance for closure, was finally returned. Sandra's story demonstrates that delayed justice is still justice. The years cannot erase the pain, but they can end the uncertainty, lift the shadow of suspicion, and provide a reckoning that transforms grief into resolution. Her family, the city, and her own memory were finally granted acknowledgement. The thief of her life was unmasked, accountable, and remembered not for decades of freedom but for the crime that defined him. This is the weight and the meaning of justice delayed, not denied. Time cannot protect those who commit evil, and it cannot silence the persistence of truth. Sandra's legacy is no longer paused. It is complete, and the darkness that concealed it has been pierced by clarity and accountability. It all began with something almost invisible, a tiny object overlooked for decades, a simple button. In its fibers rested the proof that had eluded every generation of investigators, tucked away on Sandra's coat like a quiet witness to a violent act. For 54 years, it waited, a silent messenger of truth. Its importance, hidden under layers of frost, memory, and the passage of time. What seemed insignificant became the bridge between a lifetime of uncertainty and the final revelation of justice. When the forensic team extracted the skin cells from that single button, they held in their hands the catalyst for ending half a century of shadows. It was a reminder that evidence, no matter how small, never truly disappears. The threads connected Sandra's last struggle to the man who had been part of the community, part of your everyday life, yet entirely capable of the unthinkable. Every minute spent analyzing it, every genealogical step forward, unraveled the wall of protection built by time itself. That button was more than a piece of clothing. It became the voice of a victim who had waited silently for decades. It exposed the man who had evaded suspicion, illuminated the path to his identity, and forced a reckoning that no amount of normalcy could resist. It shattered the illusion of safety, proving that no one is invisible to truth, no matter how long they walk among the unsuspecting. Sandra's story reminds us that even the smallest details can carry immense weight. The button transformed from a forgotten fragment to the instrument that finally brought clarity, accountability, and the moral resolution that had been denied for more than 50 years. The silence was broken. The story could finally be told, and the wrongs that lingered in shadows could no longer remain hidden. Sandra Miller's story stands as a warning, a lesson, and a memory that refuses to fade. The years could not erase her, and the truth could not be buried forever. From the blizzard-swept streets of Cheyenne to the quiet of her family's grief, every moment of pain and uncertainty was finally met with resolution. Justice arrived not on time, but it arrived, proving that persistence, science, and determination can pierce the longest shadows. The city, her family, and those who held her memory can now breathe. The sense of fear, loss, and unanswered questions has transformed into closure, understanding, and a solemn acknowledgement of the life she lived. Sandra's name is no longer tied solely to tragedy. It is a symbol of the inevitability of truth, the courage of those who refuse to let injustice endure, and the fragile yet unyielding strength of memory. The button, the small detail that changed everything, reminds us that even the tiniest threads can carry enormous weight. Evidence, patience, and dedication combined to right what has been wronged. One life stolen, 54 years of silence, and yet, in the end, justice is served. Every unanswered question, every tear shed, and every night of waiting has led to this moment where closure is finally felt in full. Stay prepared, stay aware, and stay subscribed, so stories like Sandra's are never forgotten. Let this case remind you that evil can hide in plain sight, but it is never beyond reach. Time may delay accountability, but it cannot deny it. And Sandra Miller, once a girl who never came home, now rests knowing that truth, memory, and justice have finally found their way.